The richest man's brother stood in the middle of the bus park, pointed at the Okada rider holding out a bag stuffed with money, and called him a thief. Emeka Obi did not lower the bag. He stood beside his worn red motorcycle, with his late father's brass-cornered leather satchel held open in his two hands, every bundle of cash still inside it, every single naira he had found that morning and carried back across the whole of Lagos to return. And he listened to a man in a navy suit and a gold wristwatch tell a laughing crowd that a poor rider like this one must surely have helped himself to a cut before pretending to be honest. The park went quiet, the way a bus park never goes quiet. The conductors stopped shouting their routes. The woman roasting corn at the corner let her coals burn untended. The same riders who, for 3 years, had laughed that Emeka was too slow, too soft, too foolish to make real money on these roads, now stood with their mouths open, while a wealthy man accused him in front of all of them. And Emeka simply held the bag a little higher, so that everyone could see for themselves that it was full. He had ridden in that morning, the way he rode in every morning, before 6, when the city was still gray and the Danfo buses were only beginning to fill. He had a sick mother on a thin mattress at home, 3 months of rent he could not pay, and a younger sister whose school fees were due in 9 days, and he had exactly 420 naira in his pocket. He counted it twice on the seat of his bike, the way a hungry man counts, hoping the number has changed. It had not. Emeka Obi was 28 years old. For 3 years he had worked this stand at the edge of the park, and for 3 years he had been, in the quiet judgment of the other riders, the one who did everything the hard, honest, unprofitable way. He did not overcharge the confused. He did not run the lights and risk a passenger's neck for an extra trip. He did not pad a fare when a tired trader fell asleep on the back of his bike. And he turned back, more than once, to return a phone or a purse a passenger had dropped, when a faster man would have ridden on and sold it by noon. The others called this softness. They had a name for him at the stand, half a joke and half a warning to younger riders. Emeka Sebastian, they called him, after a priest, because, they said, only a man of the church would leave money on the table the way he did. He had not chosen the hard way out of pride. He had chosen it because of a man who was no longer alive to see it. His father, Pa Obi, had ridden these same roads for 30 years, on an older bike, kept cleaner than any rich man's car, with this very satchel slung across his chest, in the same place Emeka wore it now, brass-cornered, brown, soft at the edges, from a lifetime of one man's hands. Pa Obi had carried strangers and their belongings across the city for 30 years, and never once lost a thing that was not his. And on the last evening he was strong enough to sit up. He had taken the satchel from around his own neck and the small brass padlock key from inside his shirt, and he had pressed both into his son's hands, and he had said the thing Emeka would carry for the rest of his life. The hands that carry other people's things, he had said, must stay clean, or one day they will carry nothing worth keeping. Carry clean, Emeka. That is the whole of it. So Emeka carried clean. He woke before the gates of the park opened. He slung his father's satchel across his chest. He kept his fares fair and his hands honest, and the world had given him, in return, almost nothing, and laughed while it did. The rent climbed. His mother's cough deepened into something the chemist's tablets no longer touched, something a doctor at a real clinic had named and put a price on, a price with too many zeros for a rider counting 420 naira on a bike seat. His sister was clever, the cleverest in her class, and the fees that would keep her in school were due, and there was no money. He had begun to wonder, on the worst nights, whether carry clean had been wisdom, or whether it had been the most expensive sentence his father ever spoke. Here is the very thing this channel was built for, So let me say it to you plainly before we go on. If you have ever done the right thing quietly, while louder people cut every corner and seem to win for it, if you have ever held to your father's word, or your mother's, or your own, when holding to it cost you, and bending would have been so easy, then you already belong here with us under the Baobab. Take one moment to subscribe to Baobab Tales, because the honest, overlooked, tested people are exactly the ones these stories are told for. And I do not want you to miss what a single forgotten bag was about to do to Emeka Obi's whole life, and to the proud man who thought he had him figured. That morning, the morning everything turned, a passenger had flagged Emeka down at the far side of the island, in the glass and marble district, where men like Emeka were waved through gates only because someone above had to be carried. The man who climbed onto the back of his bike was perhaps 55, broad and calm, wearing a pale blue agbada of the kind that costs more than Emeka's bike, and he carried, clutched against his side, a heavy bag, brown leather with brass corners, so like Emeka's own father's satchel, that Emeka noticed it at once and felt, absurdly, a small warmth toward the stranger because of it. The man was in a hurry but not unkind. He named a bank 3 districts away and asked Emeka to ride carefully, because, he said, patting the bag once, what was inside it was not only his. Emeka rode carefully. He always did. Through the morning crush, past the markets waking up, the man's heavy bag pressed between them, and when they reached the bank, the passenger paid him a fair fare and added a little on top, without being asked. The way busy men sometimes do, distracted and generous in the same breath. And he climbed off and walked toward the bank's glass doors, talking into his phone, and Emeka pulled back into traffic and rode on to find his next fare, because 9 days was 9 days, and the fees would not pay themselves. It was 20 minutes before he felt the weight that should not have been there. He had stopped at a junction, 1 foot down, and his knee had knocked against something solid. Riding on the back seat behind him, where a passenger's legs should have been and were not. He turned. The brown leather bag, with the brass corners, sat there against the seat, fat and forgotten, exactly where the man in the pale blue agbada had set it down and, in the rush of his phone call and his hurry, had risen and walked away without. Emeka pulled out of the traffic, into the shade of a half-built wall, and he lifted the flap of the bag, because a man must know what he is carrying, and he went very still. Money. Not a few notes, bundles of it, thick, rubber-banded, more high-denomination naira than Emeka had seen in one place in his entire life, packed down into the bag in neat rows and tucked along the side a fat envelope of documents, company papers, stamped and serious. He did not touch the bundles. He sat in the shade with the open bag on his knees, and his heart going like an engine, and the city roared past him, indifferent, and not one soul in all of Lagos knew that the bag was in his hands. He did the arithmetic without wanting to. He was a man who counted. Poverty had made him one. There was, by the look of it, more money in that bag than he could earn on these roads in 20 years of honest fares. There was enough in that bag to pay the rent he owed 3 times over and clear the next year besides. Enough for the doctor his mother needed, the real one, the tests, the medicine that worked. Enough for his sister's fees this term, and every term until she finished, with money left to spare. Enough, in short, for every single thing that carrying clean had failed to buy him, sitting open in his hands on an empty street where no camera watched, and no man living knew. And his father's voice came up in him, not loud, not scolding, just there, the way it had been there every morning for 11 years. Carry clean, Emeka. That is the whole of it. The hands that carry other people's things must stay clean, or one day they will carry nothing worth keeping. He sat there a long moment. He thought about his mother. He thought about the fees. He thought about the man in the pale blue agbada, patting the bag and saying, "What is inside it is not only his." And then Emeka Obi closed the flap of the bag and tightened the strap and turned his bike around and rode back the way he had come, toward the bank and the man he had no name for, carrying in his lap a fortune that was not his, to give it back. The man was no longer at the bank. A guard there, suspicious of a rider asking after a wealthy customer, would tell him nothing at first, until Emeka opened the flap just enough to show the papers, not the cash. And the guard's face changed, and he read a name off the topmost document and pointed Emeka toward a tower 3 streets over, a tall thing of blue glass, with the same name on a sign above its doors. Coker. The bag, the papers, the man in the agbada, all of it belonged to a company called Coker Haulage, and the man Emeka had carried was Chief Adewale Coker, who owned it. Emeka rode to the tower and stood at its foot with the satchel across his chest. A small man in a faded green vest beneath a great deal of glass. And he walked into a lobby so cold and so polished that he saw himself reflected in the floor. He told the woman at the desk, plainly, that he had a bag belonging to Chief Adewale Coker and had come to return it. He did not say what was in it. He had decided, on the ride over, that he would put it into the hands of the owner and no one else, because a thing that valuable should pass between only 2 pairs of hands. He did not get to the owner. He got the brother. Tunde Coker came down to the lobby because the desk had called up about a street rider asking for the chief by name, and a rider asking for the chief by name was, to Tunde, a problem to be removed before it could embarrass anyone. He was perhaps 45, the chief's younger half-brother, and he ran the operations of Coker Haulage from a glass office on a high floor, and he wore his authority the way he wore his navy suit and his gold wristwatch, tightly and with great attention to who was beneath him. He looked at Emeka, the way a clean shoe looks at a puddle. He did not ask Emeka to sit. He asked him what he wanted, and when Emeka said again that he had come to return a bag belonging to the chief, Tunde's mouth made a small, knowing curl, because in Tunde's experience, a poor man at a rich man's door was never returning anything. He was always, in the end, asking, "If you've made it this far into Emeka's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you." Emeka lifted the satchel from across his chest, and he set it on the high, polished counter between them, and he opened the flap, and he turned it so that Tunde Coker could see what was inside. And for one moment, one honest moment, even Tunde went still. The bundles, the rows of them, the fat envelope of stamped company papers along the side. Tunde's eyes moved over the money, the way a man's eyes move over a thing he has been frightened about, and something flickered across his polished face that Emeka, watching, did not understand, and would not understand for some time. A flicker that was not surprise at the money being there, but something closer to alarm at it having come back at all. Then Tunde recovered himself, and he did a thing that told Emeka exactly what kind of room he had walked into. He did not thank him. He did not call the chief. He reached into the bag, and he began, right there on the counter, to count. Not to count it, as a man counts a thing returned to him in gratitude, but to count it as a man counts a thing he suspects has been robbed. His fingers fast and hard on the bundles, his lips moving, his eyes flicking up to Emeka's face between every stack, as though to catch a guilt there. Emeka stood and let him count. He had nothing to hide, and so he hid nothing. And he watched the proud man's hands move through the money that Emeka had carried untouched across the whole of the city, and he waited to be allowed to leave. When Tunda finished counting, he was quiet for a moment, and then he looked up, and his face had settled into something cold and certain and almost satisfied, because Tunda Coker had just been handed, he believed, the perfect cover, and he was not a man to waste one. He said the bag was short. He said the chief had been carrying a far larger sum than this, that he knew the figure, that he handled the company's cash himself, and there should be more in that bag than the rider had brought, and that the only explanation a reasonable person could reach was that this clever street boy had found the bag, helped himself to a generous cut, and brought back the rest dressed up as honesty to collect a reward and turn aside suspicion. He said it smoothly, in front of the desk woman and two clerks who had drifted over, in the carrying voice of a man used to being believed. A thief, he called Emeka. A thief with a good act. Emeka felt the words land in him like cold water. He said quietly that he had not touched one naira of it, that everything he had found was in that bag, that he had ridden across the whole city precisely so that not one note would be lost. But he heard, even as he said it, how a poor man's word sounds in a marble lobby against a rich man's certainty, which is to say, it sounds like nothing. Tunda Coker waved a hand. He told Emeka to be grateful he was not calling the police, that the company would keep the recovered money naturally, and that the rider should take his good act and his empty bag and get off the property before someone decided to make an example of him. And Emeka, who had carried a fortune home through Lagos traffic, rather than keep a single coin of it, picked up his father's satchel, light now and empty, and walked out of that cold lobby a suspected thief, with the laughter of the clerks following him into the bright street. He rode home with the empty satchel across his chest and his back very straight, because his back was the one thing no one had managed to take, and the empty bag against his ribs felt heavier than it had with the money in it. He had done exactly what his father told him to do. He had carried clean, and it had bought him an accusation in front of strangers and an empty hand at the end of a day that had, for one shining and terrible hour, held the answer to every problem he owned. The story of it reached the bus park before he did, the way such stories do, twisted in the telling. By the time Emeka rode in the next morning, the other riders already had a version, and in their version, the rich man's people had caught Emeka trying to claim a reward for money he had half kept. And the riders found this very funny, because it confirmed for them the thing they had always half believed, that honesty was simply foolishness that had not yet been found out, and that even Emeka Sebastian, in the end, had tried to eat from a bag that fell into his hands and only got caught doing it. They did not say it cruelly, most of them. They said it the way people say a thing that lets them off a hook, and that was almost worse. Even the few who believed he was honest pitied him, and pity, Emeka was learning, weighs as much as scorn. Things got worse before they got better, because in these matters, they always do. The landlord came on the fourth day. Babarisi was not a wicked man, only a tired one with his own bills, and he had waited 3 months already, and he pressed a printed notice onto Emeka's door in the narrow compound, while the neighbors watched from their own doorways. And he told Emeka, not unkindly, that he had until the end of the month, and then the room would go to someone who could pay. The neighbors in the yard shook their heads. Some of them had heard the bus park version too. "Look at him," one of them said, not quite low enough, the honest one, the one who carried millions home and gave them away and still cannot pay his rent. A clever man would be a landlord now. This one will be sleeping in the street with his clean hands. That night was the lowest Emeka had been since he buried his father. His mother slept badly in the next room, her breath catching, and he sat on a low stool in the dark with the empty satchel on his knees and turned it over in his hands. And for the first time in 11 years, he was angry at the man who had given it to him. Carry clean. What had Clean bought? An empty bag, an eviction notice, a name dragged through a bus park, a sister who might leave school, a mother who might not get her medicine. He pressed his thumb against the brass key on its leather cord, the cord his father had worn against his own chest for 30 years, and he thought just once, with his whole tired heart, that perhaps his father had been wrong. And then, because his hands knew the satchel better than his mind did, his thumb found the small worn seam in the lining where the leather had come a little loose, a place he had felt 100 times and never opened. And that night, in the dark, with nothing left to lose, he worked his fingers into it. There was paper inside, folded soft, gone yellow at the creases, tucked into the lining of the bag years and years ago, and carried, unknown, on every ride Emeka had made. He carried it to the small window and the streetlight, and he unfolded it, and he saw his father's careful hand, the same hand that had signed his school forms. And at the top, in that hand, were the words, "For my son, for the day. The carrying feels like a fool's work." His father had known. Of course he had known. A man does not ride 30 honest years on Lagos roads without learning exactly how the world repays him. And Pa Obi had sat down some quiet evening near the end and written his son a letter for precisely this night, and slipped it into the lining of the bag he knew his son would carry, and said nothing, and waited, from beyond his own grave, for the day Emeka would need it badly enough to find it. Emeka read it by the streetlight with his hands shaking. "My son," his father had written, "if you are reading this, then the carrying has cost you something, and you are wondering whether your father taught you foolishness. So let me tell you the truth I learned too late to be rich from, and just in time to be at peace from. I carried for 30 years. I watched men who cheated grow fat, and men who stole sleep well, and I buried more than one of them, and I will tell you what I never saw a single one of them keep: a clean name and a quiet chest. A man who carries is only as rich as the trust he keeps. They cannot bank it for you, and they cannot eat it for you, and most days they cannot even see it. But it is the one wealth that is wholly yours, and that no rich man, no matter how he tries, can ever take out of your hands. I never had money to leave you, Emeka. I left you the only thing I had that was worth more. Keep carrying clean, not because it will pay, because it is who we are, and a man who knows who he is a man no one can truly rob. Your father." Emeka wept then in a way he had not let himself weep at the funeral, quietly so as not to wake his mother. The empty satchel in his lap, and his father's voice reaching him at last across 11 years, on the very night he had needed it, and had been ready, for the first time, to let it go. And when he was done, he folded the letter along its soft creases, and put it back into the lining where his father had left it. And he wiped his face, and something in him settled. He would lose the room. He would not lose the thing his father had left him. He would carry clean if it cost him everything, because it was who he was, and a man who knows who he is a man no one can truly rob. He did not know it, but 3 streets and a whole world away, in a high glass office, the truth was already beginning to turn. Chief Adewale Coker was not a careless man, whatever his hurry that morning had made him. He had realized the bag was gone within the hour and had braced himself, as any man would, to never see it again, because in his long experience, a fat bag left on the back of an Okada in Lagos traffic was a fat bag gone forever. So when his brother Tunde mentioned, in passing and with a certain practiced lightness, that some street rider had brought a bag to the lobby, claiming to return it, but that it had been short, and the boy clearly a thief, and the matter handled, the chief felt two things at once. The first was astonishment that any rider in this city would bring such a bag back at all, and the second, slower and colder, was a small wrong note in his brother's voice, the over-smoothness of a man explaining a thing he would rather not be asked about, because the chief knew exactly what had been in that bag. He had packed it himself that morning, and it had not been short. The figure Tunde was quietly putting about, the larger sum the rider had supposedly stolen from, was not the sum the chief had carried. It was higher. Tunde was claiming money had gone missing, that had never been in the bag in the first place. And a man does not invent a precise missing figure out of the air. A man invents it to cover a hole he already knows is there. The chief did three things, quietly, over 2 days, in the unhurried way of a man who has built something large by paying attention. He sent for the recording from the bank's own camera, the one above the entrance where he had stepped off the bike, and he watched it, leaning close to the screen, and he saw himself climb off the Okada, talking into his phone, and he saw, plainly, the bag still sitting on the back seat as the bike pulled away, forgotten by no one but himself. The rider had not lured it from him. The rider had not even known in that moment that it was there. Whatever had happened next, the boy had ridden off with a bag he did not yet know he carried, and some time later had turned around and brought it back. The camera did not lie, and the camera showed an honest accident, answered by an honest act. Then the chief examined the bag itself, the empty satchel his brother had so triumphantly returned to the company safe, and in an inner pocket, folded small, he found a thing Tunde in his haste to count the cash had never looked for, because Tunde had been looking only for what was missing. It was the bank's own sealed deposit slip from the previous week, the record of exactly what sums passed through the chief's hands. And laid against the company's books, it told the chief, in cold figures, the size of the hole, and the hole was not the rider's doing. For months, the slips in the books did not agree, in small amounts and then in larger ones, all of them flowing through the one set of hands that handled the company's cash. His brother's hands and the figure Tunde had so confidently named as stolen by the rider was, almost to the naira, the figure Tunde himself had been quietly drawing out of the company for the better part of a year. He had seen a poor, honest stranger as the perfect place to bury his own theft, and in burying it there, he had handed his brother the thread that unraveled all of it. The chief sat alone with the slip and the books and the frozen camera image, a long time. He was a man who had carried his own hard years. He had not always worn pale blue agbada, and he had not forgotten the weight of being small in a tall lobby. And he understood, sitting there, exactly what he had nearly let happen. A young man had done the rarest thing he had seen in 30 years of business, had carried a fortune home through this city, and brought back every naira of it against his own desperate need, and the thanks the boy had received, under the chief's own roof and in the chief's own name, was an accusation of theft from the very man who was the thief. The chief found that he could not let that stand quietly, with a discreet apology and an envelope sent down. The harm had been done in public, in front of a desk and a city's worth of gossip. It would have to be undone in public too. He found Emeka the hard way, The honest way, the way Tunde had never bothered to. He sent a man to the bus park to ask, not among the big operators, but among the riders, for the Okada man who had returned a bag of money. And the riders, who knew exactly who that was, even as they laughed at him, pointed the way to the edge of the park, where Emeka sat, on his worn red bike, with his empty satchel across his chest, doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was to keep working, fare by small fare, while the month ran out under him. And so, on a bright morning, 9 days after the bag, a long black car came to a stop at the mouth of the bus park, and a tall man, in a pale blue agbada, stepped out of it, and the whole park turned to look. People assumed at first that some big man was lost. Men like that did not come to the riders' end of the park, where the bikes were old and the umbrellas faded. But the man in the agbada did not look lost. He walked through the parting crowd with 2 younger men behind him, straight past the big operators, straight to the edge where the Okada riders kept their stand. And he stopped in front of the smallest, oldest red bike there, and the young rider beside it, in the faded green vest, and his composed face opened, and Emeka, looking up, knew him at once. The passenger, the man whose bag he had carried home. Chief Adewale Coker did not waste the moment, and he did not make it small. He spoke so that the whole park could hear him, the conductors and the corn roaster, and the riders who had laughed. And the first thing he did was not to praise Emeka, but to correct the record, plainly, in the carrying voice of a man used to being believed. He said that this young man had found his bag on the back of this bike, a bag containing more money than most men in this park would see in 20 years, along with the documents of his company, and that this young man, who he now knew was owed 3 months of rent and had a sick mother and a sister's fees coming due, had ridden across the whole of Lagos to bring it back, and had not taken 1 single naira. Not one. He held up a paper then, the bank's own record, and he read the figure aloud, the exact sum that had been in that bag. And he said that it had come back to him whole, every kobo of it, in the hands of the poorest honest man he had met in 30 years of doing business in this city. The park did not breathe. And then the chief turned, and he said the second thing, the harder thing, and he named it without heat. The way the truly powerful do not need heat. He said that the man who had stood in his lobby and called this rider a thief, the man who had claimed money was missing from that bag, had named a figure that money could not have gone missing because it had never been in the bag at all, and that the only place that figure existed was in the gap between the company's books and the bank's slips, a gap a year wide, flowing through the one set of hands that touched the company's cash. He did not say his brother's name in the park. He did not need to. But there were people there who would carry the meaning back to the right ears, and there would be, the chief made quietly certain in the days that followed, a full accounting at Coker Haulage. The books opened to auditors, the figures laid bare, and Tunde Coker removed from his office, and his signature, and the company entirely, stripped of the position he had used as cover, facing the auditors and the consequences of his own long, neat theft, undone not by his enemy, but by the one honest act he had tried to use to hide behind. But Emeka did not see that part, and did not gloat in it, because it was not in him, and it had never been the point. He sat on his low stool of a bike seat, in the middle of all those staring faces, the people who had pitied him, and the people who had laughed, and he did not lift his chin in triumph, or fling a single "I told you so" at the riders who had named him after a priest. He simply listened to a great man tell the truth about him in the open, the truth his own father had believed in him, without ever living to see proved, and his eyes filled, and his hand went, without his deciding it, to the brass key on the leather cord against his chest. The chief saw the gesture and asked him about it, and Emeka told him, simply, about his father, the Okada rider of 30 clean years, and the satchel, and the words, "Carry clean. The hands that carry other people's things must stay clean, or one day they will carry nothing worth keeping." And he told him, because the chief asked, about the letter he had found folded in the lining only 9 nights before, on the worst night of his life, his father's voice reaching him across 11 years to tell him a man who carries is only as rich as the trust he keeps. And the chief, who owned a fleet of trucks built on his own father's hard years, stood in the middle of the bus park and was quiet for a moment. And then he took Emeka's hand in both of his, the rider's cracked hand in the rich man's smooth ones, and he held it. And he said that Emeka's father had left him richer than most men leave their sons. What the chief did after that, he did fully, and he did in the open, the way he had done everything that morning. He did not press a reward into Emeka's hand and drive away, which would have been the easy thing and the lesser thing, and which would have made the small man come to the big man's mercy one more time. Instead, he asked Emeka, in front of the whole park, whether a man who could carry a fortune home untouched might be willing to carry the trust of other men, and he offered to set him up, properly, in his own name, with a small transport business of his own, a garage and a row of good bikes and honest young riders under him, a real concern with Emeka at the head of it, because trust, the chief said, was the one thing he could never simply hire, and here was a man who had proved he could not be bought even when he was starving. And the rent Emeka owed, the chief settled that morning, and the doctor his mother needed, the real one, and the medicine that worked. And the sister, the clever one, the chief set up a standing fund, in the name of Pa Obi, Okada rider, to carry her through school, and others like her, the children of honest working people, so that no clever young one in that family would ever again have to choose between an education and a roof. It did not all happen at once. These things never do, but it happened. By the end of that year, the smallest, oldest bike at the edge of the bus park was gone, and in its place, 2 streets over, stood a clean, bright garage with a freshly painted board and a row of good motorcycles in a line, and Emeka Obi at the head of a dozen young riders. And the first thing he taught every one of them, before he taught them the roads, was the thing his father had taught him: carry clean. He said it the way his father had said it, plainly, with no sermon attached, and he hung nothing on his garage wall but one thing: his father's worn brown satchel with the brass corners, where every young rider who came to work for him could see it, the bag that had carried a fortune home and given it all back, the bag that had been called empty by a proud man, and had turned out, in the end, to be the fullest thing Emeka owned. His mother grew well that year, slowly, on the medicine she could finally afford, and came to sit some afternoons in a good chair in the bright garage and watch her son run his honest concern. And his sister stayed in school, top of her class, on the fund in her grandfather's name. The riders at the old park who had laughed were quieter now when Emeka's name came up, and some of them, the better ones, came in time to ask him for work, humbly. And he took them on without a word about the laughing, because that was not in him either, and taught them, too, to carry clean. And now and then, a long black car would stop outside the garage, and the chief would come and sit a while on a stool and watch the young men work. 2 men who had each been left rich by fathers who had no money, and they would not say very much, and they did not need to. There was an evening near the end of that first year The garage emptied of its riders, the great city going gold, and then violet beyond the open doors. When Amika stayed late alone, the way he had stayed late so many times before, when staying late had bought him nothing at all. He took his father's satchel down from the wall and sat with it on his lap in the fading light. He ran his thumb along the brass key on its worn leather cord, the cord his father had worn against his chest for 30 years, and he had worn for 11. And he thought about the night he had nearly decided his father was wrong, and about how very little, in the end, that bag of money would have been worth set beside what he would have lost to take it. He opened the lining and read the letter through once more, his father's hand gone soft at the creases, and then he folded it and put it back where his father had left it. And he held the empty bag against him, and it was not empty, and it had never been empty. Then the bag was not empty after all, he said, alone, to no one, and to his father. It was never empty. So here is what I would leave with you tonight. Before the light goes, the world will always be quicker to call a man a fool for handing back what he could have kept than to ask what kind of wealth a clean hand carries, and quicker to believe a rich man's certainty than a poor man's word. But the trust a person keeps when no one is watching has a way of walking out into the daylight on its own 2 feet, years later, and standing up for them in a room full of the people who laughed. So I will ask you this, and I will be reading every answer. If you had been Amika Obi, with a sick mother and an empty pocket and a fortune sitting open in your hands on an empty street where no one would ever know, would you have turned the bike around and carried it back the way your father told you? Or would you have kept quiet and kept it and let the world call you clever instead of a fool? Tell me honestly, which of those 2 people you are, the one who carries it back or the one who keeps it? And so the fire burns low under the old baobab tree. Stay a while and tell me in the comments where you watched from.